Welcome back to another teaching moment from the books. We are at chapters 11 and 12 at this point, and this is the big momentous battle that everyone thinks about when they think of David. And even Saul and Jonathan, everything about that story, everyone thinks one thing: Goliath. And so this is really the battle that defined David's military career from here on out, and he wasn't even expecting it. Maybe he was hoping for it, but he wasn't expecting it up to that point. Now, chapters 11 and 12 are basically Jonathan and then David's perspective on the battle, and then the chapters immediately following are related to everyone's response to it. So I guess this teaching moment encapsulates those two. One of the secrets of writing is that the more you write, the less smoothly you can speak. It's very interesting. But the point about David and Goliath, we'll go into greater detail in future videos when I talk through the Bible study. I would like to go into greater detail on the historical insights and the cultural things that I've learned for the Bible study and in writing this series. But for these teaching moments for the novels, I just want to focus on the major highlights, the moments that we can take away and easily remember with the characters. Now, David had been walking with God up to this point, and this momentous battle was the result of what had already been built up between him and God. We've already talked about how faithful he was in menial things and how he was ready for this because he was after God's heart. So he was anointed by God, carrying the presence of God, and he understood what God was up to and how to be a part of it because he was faithful to God's will. He was committed to whatever God wanted to do. And he got there already understanding that whatever he would find, whatever he would encounter, would be easy for God to defeat. And now in scripture, we see that Jonathan and David use a lot of the same language when it comes to their epic battles. Jonathan's battle at Michmash, he said lots of things like, God can save by many or by few. God will save Israel today and will deliver them into our hands. David said many of the same things, which is really the mark of something that has God all over it. When a person is committed to God's glory and understands how to bring that about, God is remembered as the victor in both Jonathan and David's battles. So that's something else they had in common. Now, Jonathan and Saul had very different responses to Goliath's death, and this is where I get most of my evidence for how they acted in the previous chapters. We've touched on that a little bit, like where did I get my characterizations? How did I know how they acted in other situations? Well, Saul and Jonathan didn't randomly decide how to respond to Goliath. It wasn't just a split-second decision because they knew they would be in Scripture. They had been building up to this moment just like David. And what came out in that stressful, momentous moment was something that had been simmering for a while. Jonathan was open to God's will, and therefore he recognized David as God's answer. And he was so grateful that he decided to equip him and be his friend. He was aligning himself with God and God's will by joining himself to David. And that was not a marriage covenant. It was not anything subversive like the world tries to paint it. It was a powerful brother covenant that's one of the most beautiful stories of friendship in historical narrative. And again, I've learned a lot about the ins and outs of that covenant, and I'll talk about that in other videos. But right now, again, I'm sticking with just their responses to Goliath. On the other hand, Saul was not walking with God, and therefore he wasn't able to see God's hand at work as a good thing. He had set himself against God, and so he viewed God's work as competition or a conspiracy against him. Keep in mind that anything that paints God as your enemy is a lie from the real enemy. Remember, his first lie to Eve in the garden was that God was keeping things from her and holding her back. Saul believed that if he couldn't have the throne, God was the enemy that was taking it from him. And then he had to fight tooth and nail anyone else that was trying to take it from him. But Jonathan also knew that he would not be king. He was also aware of that. But instead of fighting it, he worked with God and wanted to be part of God's plan, whatever role he got to play. And this is powerful. It basically is the key to whether you're going to have, it's the crossroads to whether or not you're going to have a frustrating life fighting God or a place in his plan. Whether you're the giant killer or the best friend who gives him a robe and a weapon, your God-given role is honorable. And if you give it your all, because Christ gave you his all, you will find your place in the epic story God is still writing. And that is so worth being a part of.